Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 24th, 1921. Tensions are ratcheting up in Logan County, West Virginia, in the southwest part of the state, not too far from Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains. This is coal country. And what was simmering and brewing and about to explode was a massive labor dispute between coal miners and coal companies, and eventually intervention from the U.S. government. In the coming days, the strikes and protests would evolve into violence and bloodshed, the largest labor uprising in United States history, some 10 to 15,000 striking miners, and ultimately, as I said, intervention from federal troops. Now, there's a lot to be said about what would come to be known as the Battle of Blair Mountain, but it is worth pointing out that one reason we are doing this episode is because over the last couple months, we've done episodes on the Tulsa Massacre, also in 1921, and the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia in the 80s. And in both of those, we remarked and talked a little bit about how government-aligned forces or people backed by the government had dropped bombs on American citizens, and we kind of marveled at that and wondered, has this ever happened at other points in American history? And we got a ton of emails from folks saying that yes, it had. During the Battle of Blair Mountain, President Harding threatened to send in army bombers, and a number of homemade bombs were dropped on protesters from airplanes. So thank you, listeners, for suggesting this. This is a remarkable story, and let's get into it now with Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our guest for this episode is Anna Sale, host of the podcast Death, Sex, and Money. Her book is called Let's Talk About Hard Things, and she is also a West Virginia native, so someone we've wanted to have on the show for a long time, and that's enough of an excuse. You're from West Virginia. You're on the show. Hi, Anna. Let's talk about Blair Mountain.
Oh, thank you for having me. I actually love this history and think it's not as broadly known as it should be, because it's a stunning story. It's a stunning story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and so within West Virginia, I mean, growing up in school, was there a 3 days on the Battle of Blair Mountain in 8th grade or something?
Yeah, 8th grade and 4th grade, we did West Virginia history. So definitely I had heard about it. And then the other thing that I think was particular to my generation of West Virginia school children is I was in elementary school in the 80s when John Sayles' movie Matewan came out. If you have not seen it, it's a really great way to learn about the Battle of Blair Mountain and the events leading up to it. And also Chris Cooper and David Strathairn are in it. And Will Oldham plays a teenage Appalachian minister. So it was sort of like very much present. I knew about it as a kid. And then when I went back to West Virginia after college, I became aware of a local effort to conserve the land where the Battle of Blair Mountain had actually happened, because it was mine company land. It was part of it was slated to be mined, mountaintop removal mined. So I walked through the hills of where the battle and the march took place, and there's a local historian, Chuck Keeney, who's related to Charles Keeney, who was involved back 100 years ago, and you could still find, he had a collection of things that people had found kind of like hiking around, signs of battle just buried in the dirt.
This is such a fascinating story. And just to take us back into 1921, this was an era of considerable labor activism, of radicalism. But it seems to me that this story in particular is so rooted in a local place. And not that it's not affected by those global forces, but we're talking about miners who had been mining this land for decades and who were trapped in a system of labor exploitation that you really marvel at in the 1920s, right? It reminds you of sharecropping in the sense that they're in company towns. They're paid in scrip, which is not real currency. It can only be used at the company store, and paid low wages. The corporations, the mining corporations, are beating back any attempt at labor organizing, and they're being backed up by the federal government in their attacks on labor. It feels very much like a story from the 1870s and 1880s transplanted into the 1920s.
And this does start to simmer with the Matewan shootout, and it is this sort of building thing over the course of a couple weeks, a number of protests, sort of roving groups of skirmishes and protests, and then it does culminate in what I think is officially the heavy fighting of the Battle of Blair Mountain is towards the end of August and into early September. As I said, some 10,000 men are sort of amassed near the border. They were referred to as the Redneck Army. Always nice to have a nice nickname for your group.
Because of red kerchiefs that they wore around their necks.
They had to distinguish themselves. They had to distinguish themselves from their opposing group. And so that is how they let others know that they were on their side, with a red handkerchief tied around their neck.
And I have to say, that was like a really powerful fact to know growing up in West Virginia, where you are, very aware of being called a redneck and people seeing you as a redneck, and to know that there was this way to really think of that word in a very much more powerful way.
When I think of just the sheer numbers, I mean, we're talking between 10 to 15,000 labor union workers, and that this is like a legit battle. This is not just a strike or a boycott. This is bloodshed. There's bullets are being, the rounds of ammunition that's being used. I was shocked that, as I grew up, I had never heard of this story before. I knew about certain labor strikes, but not battles. And that's exactly really what takes place. This is a battle.
And this is where it feels like World War I is actually important, because so many of these strikers who gathered there were veterans, and they had military-issued rifles and shotguns, and they're in some ways bringing the war home because they've had these experiences as soldiers, and they're using it to liberate themselves back in the U.S.
I'm just reflecting on that. Like, imagine you come home for fighting for your country in World War I, and you look around your coal community, your coal camp, and you join with your fellow miners, and you're marching for better conditions, and the federal government brings planes in to quell your protest. And
planes that had been built for World War I, and munitions that were built for World War I. So it's not just, you're using the tools, you're coming back from war, and then the tools of the war that you were taking part in are being used against you. It's just remarkable. And, I think, to restate it, the notion of it as a battle, I think, is important to keep in mind. We have, basically a group pinned against the mountain or trapped on a mountain and being attacked and eventually bombarded. So let's get to that bombing element of it here. The local officials call on the federal government to intervene, and Harding does threaten to basically scramble airplanes from a local base to come. The bombing that ends up happening does appear to be more, and this is what happened in Tulsa as well, but it does appear to be more like private citizens gathering up munitions and flying over and dropping bombs. And a lot of these munitions were left over from World War I. They were around because of the war effort, but you get this mix, and we've seen it in so many stories that we've talked about, this mix between state power and sort of ad hoc local power.
Right, local power that's very much backed up by the state. But there is a story here of the federal government siding with corporations to attack these workers, but there's also a story about these corporations attacking the government, because it was detectives that were hired by the mining corporations who killed a local sheriff who was defending the miners. And I feel like that gets lost in this story in a way that feels important, because, to spoil the ending of this, some of the miners are brought up on charges of treason for fighting back against the federal government. And you're like, well, wait a second. The corporations were killing members of the government as well. So it's a really fascinating and complex story.
Yeah, when you think of the numbers too, I mean, 985 miners are indicted for murder, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, treason against the state of West Virginia. A lot of these people go on to become, acquitted. They have sympathetic juries, but for some people they serve time. I mean, this is not something that goes without punishment in a lot of ways, and it's a double sort of slap in the face for people who have just literally tried to fight their exploitation, only to be slammed back down again by the state.
And it does genuinely break up the union. I mean, there's only a few hundred members of the union at the end of this. The unions don't really come back in a strong way until the 30s. And so, that ultimately, I think, is one of the big legacies here.
Yeah, I just thinking about that timeline, so this is happening in the early 20s, and then the 30s, there's the New Deal, there's this expansion of unionization efforts. And then growing up in the 80s in West Virginia was a time when there was a real, really effective efforts to break up the union by waiting out strikes. And that was happening when I was a kid. And I've been thinking about the United Mine Workers of America with the recent passing of Richard Trumka, who went on to be the leader of the AFL-CIO, but he started out in the United Mine Workers. So up until his death just a week or so ago, a leader who was sort of trained in the trenches of the United Mine Workers was at the head of the labor movement of this country. So this history is 100 years old, but it's also quite with us. Yeah.
And that through line is important, too, because it tells you about the importance of whose back the federal government has, right? When the federal government has the back of the mines, then they break workers' solidarity pretty quickly, because they have the power of the military behind them and the power to bring charges like treason. In the 1930s, when the federal government is backing unions, they have real power, and they're able to build these lasting institutions. And as we talked about on the show a couple weeks ago, in 1981, Ronald Reagan takes on the air traffic control unions, and it starts this series of attacks on unions, dismantling them, even though the laws haven't really changed, but who the president backs has changed. And that sort of unleashes all of this pent-up anti-union activism. So it matters a lot where the federal government stands in these stories.
Yeah, and who's at the helm of it, who's president, who's where the final sort of source of responsibility or leadership falls to.
Where the buck stops.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, Harding is a part of the Tulsa story and part of this. I mean, we're just to make it clear, this is just a few months after Tulsa. And I think it's important to think of them as both paralleled but also connected for all the reasons we've been discussing.
It just also shows you, and I know we've talked about this before, but about how the country responds to the poorest or the most exploited or people of color in this country, I think is a real, not to use the pun, but canary in the coal mine. It lets you know, I had to get that in there, I'm sorry. But in terms of how people are treated at the so-called bottom, I think lets us know what matters, and who doesn't.
Yeah. So, as we start to wrap up, and I'm curious, around Tulsa, there was a big conversation about historical memory and both the need to put the story of Tulsa into books and to have plaques and markers and really sort of codify the historical memory. But then there was also this other related conversation about the fact that people remember, right? Black people in Tulsa remember the Tulsa Massacre, regardless of whether it's in the history books or not. And I'm curious whether that sort of the contours of that conversation also apply here. And if you can talk a little bit about that sort of dynamic between just the stories we tell in codified official ways versus the stories that families in West Virginia, as you said, not that long ago, a couple generations removed from this, keep this history alive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I would answer that question is, when I was a child growing up in West Virginia, it was still very much a democratic state where the labor history and the power of labor was a defining force in how state politics sort of operated. And that has really changed in the last, 10 to 15 years. I mean, the legislature flipped in 2014 and it has had Republican control since. And so I'm kind of curious, like I don't live in West Virginia now, so I wonder what the dialogue around the Battle of Blair Mountain is. Is it about the overreach of government and why you shouldn't trust the feds because they're going to come for you when you join together to protect your families and your community and to fight for yourselves? That could very well be a narrative. I mean, when I was growing up, this was a history that we were proud of. It felt significant. It felt like an important thing had happened in West Virginia, and we wanted more people to know about it. But certainly there's different ways to tweak the narrative for whether it's a story about the potential of labor organizing and what happens when it gets quashed, or is it about why you shouldn't trust strong federal government because they're going to come for you? I would say anybody who's interested should go to the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum, which is a newish institution that does tell this story locally. You can go to wvminewars.org and check it out and just see how the people who have thought a lot about the Battle of Blair Mountain and who continue to live and work in West Virginia, how they tell this story.
Yeah. And, this is the 100th anniversary. I think, as with Tulsa, hopefully we'll see a bigger conversation. And I mean, to your point, actually, how we remember something reflects a lot about our current moment, in addition to the story itself. And so we'll be curious to see. I mean, there is a sort of resurgent conversation about labor, and if this gets fit into that might be fascinating versus some of the other contours you described. So we've done our part. We've tried to, talk about this really fascinating moment, and really glad to have had Anna Sale on to do it with us. So Anna, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for this show.
And, of course, the podcast is Death, Sex, and Money, and the book is Let's Talk About Hard Things. Go check it out. It is wonderful. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.